So going on, I'm going to be talking about registration for MR and CT scans today, and this lecture was a little bit more special, where it was a collaboration between ChiChi Han and I. He's a PhD student currently at Professor Wang's lab. So an overview of what we're going to be talking about today, same structure as the other videos. We're going to talk about what exactly is registration in simple terms. Then we're going to go into talking about the importance, so why is it significant? And then we're going to start talking about the fundamental concepts before finishing off with the mathematical concepts. So what is registration? In simple terms, it's basically this workflow that we're seeing right now. What we see is that we have that image at the beginning. So when it's disoriented, as you can see in this case, so originally it should be looking like that. But when it's disoriented, what registration does is that it goes through a set of these processes so that this image can go from that disoriented image to something that is more flat and more readable, so that we're able to get a better sense of what image we're actually looking at. So we're not able to identify this last part from these two images. And so with registration, a lot of times it includes different modalities. So a lot of the times we would use MRI scans, CT scans, PET scans, and SPECT scans. But for the sake of our purposes today, we're only going to be focusing on MR and CT scans. So to combine all this knowledge that we talked about before, by using MRI and CT scan in order to register these two images together, this is exactly what it looks like. So originally the CT scan was not in green. I changed up the color a little bit so that you guys can get a better sense of what I'm talking about. So what happens with registration is that we have these two different images at the beginning, and our output after registration should be the compilation, or having these two images overlap so that we're able to get a better sense of what we're looking at when we're comparing these two different images. So it should align in some sort of way so that we're able to be like, hey, potentially this tumor is in this section, which is the same section as the other image, or maybe even off in the other image. So there are two different types of registration that I would like to share with you. The very first kind would be the intensity-based registration, and the second kind is the feature-based registration. So one thing to note about the intensity-based is that it is comparing the intensities in specific positions. So the way that I would like to see it is that for each of the pixels that we're looking at, intensity-based registration looks at these individual pixels or these individual positions and compares the intensities in order to be able to register the images together. The feature-based registration actually compares the positions of the original image to the other image. So I would like to view this as a more overall. So what ends up happening is that we're viewing the entire image during registration as opposed to a single pixel. And so one thing to note is that as a summary of what registration is, it is determining the spatial alignment between images of the same or different subjects acquired with the same or different modality. So that's something that we're going to go into a little bit deeper in the remaining of the lecture, where registration can occur in multiple kind of scenarios and in multiple kind of situations. So talking about the significance of registration. So the applications and significance, as I stated before in that summary of what registration is, can occur in three different kinds of scenarios. So the very first scenario would be the same subject, which is considered as intermodal, the phrase for that. And basically what happens is that we may have multiple images acquired at different times. And this may be in the morning or in the afternoon or at night, where we have these different scans that are taken at different times. And due to a lot of biological reasons, as I'll explain later, it is there may be differences in the images. So it won't be the same if we take it in the morning, in the afternoon, and at night. The images would not be the same. And because of this, we would potentially need registration for the same subject or the same person. Second scenario would be for different subjects, and this is considered as intramodal. And so for different subjects, it could be potentially a situation where you're comparing 5 different kinds of subjects or 5 different people who have brain tumors. However, they may be in different locations. So if you're looking at the images or you're trying to compare maybe this tumor has a tendency to grow in a certain area of the brain, what we end up having to do is that we can register all these 5 different subjects together, or the images of all these 5 different subjects together, in order to identify, hey, maybe there is a specific region where this tumor actually grows. So that's where registration is important in scenario 2. And so scenario 3 would be different modalities. So this would be considered as intramodal as well. And the different modalities were mentioned at the beginning, where there were 4 different kinds of modalities. And so this may be a situation, or may be significant in a situation where a patient is being transferred from hospital A to hospital B. And in this situation, maybe hospital A doesn't have the resources that hospital B has. So for example, one of them only has MRI scans and the other only has a CT machine. And so in this case, by having a registration process, we're able to register these 2 different images together as the patient is getting transferred from hospital A to hospital B, so that the doctors are able to, I guess, in a sense, compare or analyze this patient's condition or the situation. Maybe the scan was taken 3 months before, or maybe it was taken 6 months. And seeing that disease progression is very important for the physician in order to identify tumor types and the progression of treatments or the effectiveness of treatments. So this is where registration may become important when we're talking about different modalities. And so an intermodal situation, as I explained before, would be a situation where we have the exact same subject but taken at different times. And so in this situation, as you can see, these are 3 different images taken at different times: morning, afternoon, and night. And as you can see from the naked eye, there isn't a very obvious difference between all of these 3 images. However, the truth is that there is a difference. As you can see here, in this section, it is very different from the afternoon section. So that's something that it would be very hard for us as human beings to pick up immediately. But for a computer, registering these 2 images is going to make it so much easier when we're overlapping these 2 things together and being like, hey, there's a difference in this area. And you can think of this as one of those childhood games that we used to play when we would have a lot of distractions, and it would ask you, for example, to find a specific character. Let's just say Mickey Mouse. Let's find the number of Mickey Mouses that you would see in this area. And potentially in this situation, registration would be comparing these 2 images together, where most of the image would be the same between these 2 different images, but there would be slight differences in certain areas. And by registering these 2 images together, you can identify the differences in the small areas that we're trying to look at. Looking at an intramodal situation, we can see in this case, which is between different subjects. And so one thing to note is that this isn't of the brain, this is actually of the pancreas, or the kidney, sorry. But one thing to note about this is the fact that these are 5 different kinds of patients with the same MRI scan. However, as you can see by these masks, they're very, very different. And for a doctor to be able to look at the difference between each of these kidneys would be very hard without registration. So through scaling, through rotation, through a lot of all these different processes that we're going to talk about later, it would make a physician's life a lot simpler when they're trying to compare, for example, where the tumor is growing. Let's just say there's a tumor that was growing here. And in order for the doctors to be able to compare this with the remaining of the patients, whether or not that tumor is growing there, would require a lot of registration or a registration process in order to immediately identify how off that tumor is in terms of positioning in each of these patients. Think of it as a more precise measurement. So going on to the fundamental concepts of registration. So the entire process, as I would like to see it, this is a lot simpler than the segmentation classification that we saw before. In terms of this entire process, there is an image that comes in. So I'm going to be talking about how the computer reads the image. And then we're going to be talking about the resampling process, and then the actual transformation process, which is where registration occurs. So these are the very important steps that are part of registration. And one thing that I'd like to note is that I didn't have interpolation as its own category, because interpolation actually plays a role in both the resampling and the transformation process. So how does the computer read the image? So one thing to note is that while we're looking at these images, it is very simple, as I explained before, for the human eye or the human brain to see these images and immediately see the features that we have been trained to recognize. So in this case, for example, we would see this as the eye, or this is the brain, and this is the skull, and this as potentially the nose. However, for a computer, they don't read the images in this way, as we saw with that elephant situation in the classification lecture. A lot of the times the computer reads this and all they see is pixels. All they see is numbers. They're not able to register or assign each of these pixel numbers to a feature that we as humans would actually recognize. So reading the image is very different for a computer as it is for human beings. As a result, a lot of the times this is a diagram that is obtained from sklearn, because this is how they usually read the images. And what ends up happening is that as we input an image into the algorithm, it assigns that image to different values. So first thing that they would do is to define the origin, and then we would have the pixel width, for example, or pixel height, and that would be noted in terms of the spacing for each of these pixels. And then we would have the direction. So in which way is the image oriented on the axis that we're looking at? And then going in deeper details, what we see is that, as we were talking about, this is spacing 1 and spacing 2. So the height and the length of each of these pixels. And one thing to note is that this is the image origin. So every single time, a lot of times when we're looking at diagrams or grids, we tend to note, or we tend to see that middle part where the two lines intersect as a point. However, when we're reading images, or when the computer is reading images, what it tends to do is that middle point of the spacing grid that we have defined. So each of these middle points is what we're going to be looking at, or is what is important to a computer. And so one thing to note is that when we're talking about interpolation, what it usually happens is in the region of the pixel region. So what we're talking about is in between each of these things. And so for the pixel coverage, a lot of times it's the entire pixel. So the box that we see, each of these are pixels, and these are pixel centers. But when we're talking about interpolation, it is between the spacing that is between the 4 neighboring pixels that we'll see, or the 4 neighboring pixel coordinates or origins that we will be seeing. And so one thing to know as we're reading the images is that there are 2 different kinds of images when it comes to registration. So there is a moving and there is a fixed image. So I'd like to refer to the fixed image as a reference image, something that the algorithm or the registration algorithm refers to every single time it is trying to register that moving image. So as we can see in this diagram, what we tend to have is that moving image, and it goes through these multiple transformation processes before becoming registered with that fixed image. So what we would end up seeing is this original moving image being rotated and going through all these processes so that it ultimately ends up looking very similar, or maybe even exactly the same thing as the fixed image or the reference image. And so one thing to know as we're talking about resampling is, let's kind of jog our memories back onto how we defined that grid that we were looking at the 2 slides earlier. And so these are in coordinates of voxels, units of voxels. So as we stated before in previous lectures, voxels are in terms of a 3D kind of sense of image analysis. And so one thing to note is that we're looking at the pixel value, which is that middle point, and the pixel region as we're talking about resampling. So this is just a rejogging our memories in terms of how resampling occurs. So the entire idea behind resampling is that we're trying to create new points in order for the entire image, or in order for the 2 images, the registered and the fixed image, or the moving and the reference image, to become more comparable to each other. So the way that I would like to see this is, for example, in 2 different situations. So let's say that this is the fixed image and this is the moving image. So looking at these 2 graphs, we can see that in terms of spacing, they're similar. They're very, very similar in terms of shape, in terms of a lot of things. However, in reality, it's actually very different, as we can see on the left side. They're very, very different when you're looking at them. One is actually increases exponentially faster than the other, but it wasn't differentiable when we split them up into two. So this is where resampling becomes important. We're having them both, or both of the images, on the same scaling, on the same grid, so that they can become more comparable, so that registration is a lot easier for the entire algorithm itself. And so going on briefly to talking about transformation, for the sake of our purposes today, we're only going to be focusing on linear transformations, which include rotation, shearing, translation, and scaling. And you can see what each of these transformations mean by comparing it to the original structure, which is the square. And so one thing that I would like to ask you guys after everything that we've talked about is what kind of transformations are needed and why? So looking at these images, which is a patient with early signs of ischemia, what kinds of transformations do you guys think you would need in order to compare these three images, which is something that I'm hoping that you guys remember, which is the same patient but different times? So honestly, there's no right answer to this. You can compare it in any single way. So we can say shearing, we can say rotation, we can say scaling, we can say anything basically. There is no right or wrong answer with our own eyes. So with the human eyes, it is very biased because what we may see may be different from what someone else may see. So I may say like shearing or scaling, but someone else may say rotation and shearing. So when humans compare these images, it is very easy for it to become biased when we're trying to register. And so this is why it's so important for the computer to come in, where they have a set algorithm or a set rule. You can think of it as a number of rules where they go through, a number of steps that they go through that becomes more standardized for these images to become more registered. So one computer can help us decide on everything together. So talking about interpolation, it includes three different kinds that we usually see. So what exactly is interpolation? I would like to think of it as a type of estimation. So interpolation basically allows us, it is a method of constructing new data points from our discrete known set of points. So in this case, it may be, for example, if we had 1,000 pixels on one of the images, such as the reference image had 1,000 pixels, and the moving image only had 500. What we would need is interpolation, so that we're able to create an additional point between the 2 points for that 500 pixel image, so that we can create 1,000 pixels, so that these two images can be registered together or can be compared together, as we saw in resampling, where we need it on the same grid. That's the entire process, or the entire need or function of this interpolation method. So going on to talking about nearest neighbor, which is the simplest interpolation method that we have ever come across. And the concept behind it is determining the nearest neighboring pixel. So the way that I would like to see it as, if you're imagine yourself, close your eyes, imagine yourself standing in a room where there are 4 corners to that room, very distinctively. And imagine yourself standing near the door, which is to the left side of the room. So bottom left side if we're looking from above. And so what we would see with this bird's eye view is the fact that if we're standing near the door, which is on the bottom left, what the nearest neighbor algorithm does is that it interprets your point as that door point. So we would define ourselves as that point, because without consideration of anything else. So this is why I told you this is the simplest thing. Wherever I'm closest to, that would be the point that I would define myself as. The 3 other corners in the room is useless to this algorithm. So the advantages of this concept, or of this algorithm, is the fact that it is the shortest amount of calculation time, and it is great for categorical data. So you can imagine categorical data as water, junk food, and let's say healthy foods. And in this situation, it is very easy. It doesn't need to consider anything else. No diet, no genetics, no other factors. Junk food, you can imagine Oreos, goes straight in junk food. It's very easy to split up without any other consideration or weighting system. It is very quick and just very it's a very good decision process for categorical data. The disadvantage to this is the fact that it ends up with pixelated image, and it is very blocky when you're using it on continuous data, as we will see later in a visualization process. So this makes sense because we're not considering any other parts of the room except for the closest corner. And so that's why we end up with a lot of pixelated images a lot of times. There's no consideration of any gray numbers or any numbers between 0 and 1. It's either 0 or 1, no decimal point. And so this is exactly what I was talking about before. And so just to summarize what I was talking about for nearest neighbor, imagine yourself on the bottom right corner in this case. And so if you're closer to D, what nearest neighbor does is that it doesn't consider A, B, or C at all. All it considers is D because you're closest to that, and it immediately categorizes you into D, nowhere near A, B, or C. Bilinear interpolation is a better method, or you can think of it as a step-up method from nearest neighbor. So the concept of this is that you have weighted averages of the 4 nearest cell centers. Closer points to P would have higher values. So in the case of the room, as we were talking about before with the A, B, C, and D, if you're closer to D, then that means that the D would have a higher weighting or a higher value since it is the closest corner to P. And then obviously the B area, which is the furthest away, which is diagonally from where you're standing right now, would have the lowest value because it is the furthest away from your point right now. So that would have the lowest weighting. And when you end up having is adding up all these values, you're able to determine your spacing relative to all 4 points or all 4 corners of the room. So the advantage of this is the fact that it is good for continuous data, and the output can be different from the input, but it remains within that input range that we originally had, which we will show you, or you will see in the visualization later. And the disadvantages to this is the fact that it's not recommended for categorical data. And you can think of this as if you're trying to categorize yourself, if going back to that Oreo situation, some people may argue Oreo is actually very healthy. It's not as high in sugar or whatever. Some people need sugar. And maybe say they may categorize that as healthy data. And so in that situation, we would know that it's very difficult for us to have all these different weightings for us to be able to determine something that can be clearly or very easily categorized into one section without further considerations of other factors. And another disadvantage to this bilinear interpolation is the fact that it needs a larger amount of calculation. So going on to the cubic convolutional method, I would say that this is a step up, a further step up to bilinear interpolation. And the concept of this is the fact that you're finding 16 nearest cell centers instead of 4 to the output and fits a smooth curve through all of the points to find the value. However, the advantages of this is the fact that it's really good for continuous and smooth data. However, the curve can cause a lot of outputs to lie outside of the range of input values or the input range. And one thing to note about this is the fact that it is also very time consuming to compute. So since there's a lot more data going in, there's a lot more computational stuff that it needs to go through. So a lot of times we wouldn't see this method used as much. So going on to talking about the visualization, as I was talking about before, there's a reason why the images become more pixelated, as we can see in this situation. It is blocky because you're taking a step up from each step. So there's no data in between these two. So as I said before, this may be 0 and 1. There's no data between that 0 and 1. So there would be some kind of unknown data between these two, which makes the entire image more pixelated. On the other hand, when it comes to bilinear interpolation, what we meant by the smooth or the output range becoming or staying within that input range is you can see this line here. So these two lines are at different heights, and by combining or connecting these two different linear interpolations, we can see a smooth line that is descending from that higher to the lower. So as you can see, it's staying within that high to low range. So any of the outputs are staying within. However, with the cubic convolution, as we can see here, what ends up happening is that you have that curve that goes up and then down. So that upward motion that you see here is already going outside of the input range that we originally had. And that was the disadvantage to cubic convolution. So going on to the mathematical concepts of registration. So the entire pipeline or the workflow of registration, as I would like to explain here, is that we start off with the pre-processing. So if the image needs pre-processing, it would go through that process. And having that pre-processed image, we would go through that entire resampling process that we talked about before going into the entire transformation process, which is the very first part, where we're finding the transformation function. So that would consist of the transformation matrix. It would consist of the metrics, the interpolator, and the optimizer, which we'll explain in this section in further details. And applying that transformation function to the original moving image, we would have this outputted registered image. So to reiterate, what exactly is resampling? And the answer is already given to you guys, but just a reminder, it is changing the number of pixels in the image. So as we explained before, that 5,000 to 1,000 kind of idea or concept, that's what resampling is. We're trying to make sure that the number of pixels of the moving image is going to be the same as the reference image, so that's easier for us to be able to register the two images together. So you're aligning, you can think of it as aligning the pixels or the points together in order to get our registered image. However, if we have different numbers of pixels, it's going to be a lot harder to be able to register the two images together because there are no points that exist in between or to compare it with. So in terms of transformation, this is a mathematical equation. And so this is the transformation function that we talked about before. And as seen here, the A is the operation matrix, X is that moving image that we were talking about, C is the center point that we have defined, and T is the translational vector. So using this, we would be able to find that transformation function where we're able to put in our moving image in order to get our registered image. And so an example of transformation, as I would like to talk about again, is imagine we had this image at the beginning. And so what ends up happening is that it's not a direct method of just like having two things overlap on top of each other. So let's have a very good example right now. So everyone close your eyes and put two hands out. And what I'd like you guys to do is to overlap them on top of each other like this. And with each of the overlap with your eyes closed, I'd like you guys to open your eyes and see how close your two hands were on top of each other. And so what you would learn is that I'm hoping with each iteration or with each try that you guys do take, you would realize that you get closer and closer to two hands exactly being overlapping on top of each other. And so that's it's the exact same kind of situation when it comes to registration, or when we're trying to register a moving image to the reference image. So the bottom hand that we originally had when we're doing that hand situation would be our reference, and the top would be the moving. And so it goes through each of these iterations, so it would move from like side to side to side until it finally has these two images that are overlapping each other. And that's when you know registration has happened. Same thing as your hand situation. And I'd recommend you guys to kind of do it yourself a little bit to understand what I'm talking about when we're talking about the intuition behind registration. So talking about the mutual information concept. So I'd like to kind of dive in a little bit deeper into the mathematical concepts behind registration conceptually. So mutual information is part of information theory. So one thing that I'd like you guys to remember is that entropy in this case means measure of information. So in this case, it doesn't mean that thermodynamic law that we've all learned. In this case, it means the measure of information. So mutual information allows us to learn how much one random variable tells us about the other. And so it helps us reduce our uncertainty about one random variable given the information or knowledge about the other. So what this actually means is, let's look at this diagram on the side. So let's just say we had this original image on the left, or this original h of x. And so moving that h of y, by moving it closer together, we would know more and more about the right random variable, for example, by overlapping it. So this mutual information in the middle is where we're able to determine the two things. So let's take colors, for example, yellow and blue. So we all know adding these two colors makes green, right? So imagine if we originally had blue as our fixed color and we're trying to add the yellow in to create the green. So you would be starting off with a deeper green to begin with, right? So the more yellow that you add, the more the greener or the lighter green you get. And in this situation, we can apply that to mutual information where we know that the more yellow that we're adding, the more lighter green that we're getting. So we know more about the blue and the yellow, or we know more about the blue depending on how much yellow we're adding and the output that we're getting, so the mutual information that we're getting. So that's the entire concept of mutual information. So one question that I'd like to ask you guys is, if we have high mutual information, will our uncertainty about another random variable increase or decrease? So the answer is already actually there, but it would actually decrease. And I would like you guys to think about why, depending or judging by what we talked about before. So going back to that blue and yellow situation, if we have more green, or if we have more information about that green, then we could tell more about how much yellow we added or what kinds of yellow we added into that blue. If you think about it, if we have a more orangey yellow, the green may be different from a more yellow kind of yellow. So judging by the output or the information that we get from the green, we're able to determine more about the yellow that we have inputted, or the unknown yellow that we have inputted or that we have added to the blue color. So applying this entire mutual information to registration, things that I would like to note is the fact that the applied theory is basically comparing the statistical dependence between the two images. So looking at the image of the fixed image and the moving image, by looking at these two images, we're able to determine the mutual information between the two. The use and the purpose of this is the fact that we're maximizing the image similarity function. So one thing to note is that's not going to give us the best, or it's not going to give us a perfect kind of minimization, but what the algorithm does is that it ensures that we're able to get the optimal amount of information that overlaps, but definitely not the perfect kind of information that overlaps. And the advantage of this is the fact that it is very adaptable to changes in lighting and changes between sensors. So it makes a lot of assumptions, prior assumptions, so that this algorithm can work. So it's not dependent on, for example, the machine or the MRI machine. So talking about the joint histogram of image registering. So I'd like you guys to take a look at these 4 images on top. So a question for you guys right now is, which image do you think would represent 2 images being perfectly registered? Do you think it's the leftmost or the rightmost? So yeah, I would agree if you guys got this answer. This image actually has the most registered components to it. And you can see here, this is the dispersion of clustering increasing. So what we see is that there is more and more clusters, or more and more gray areas that we see outside of that line, which actually ultimately represents the 2 images being further and further apart. So there's more differences between these 2 images that are on top of each other. So we see that dispersion of clustering that exists here. Whereas in this lined situation, we can see the 2 colors as the blue and the yellow adding up together. So in this situation, you would still see a little bit of the blue and a little bit of the yellow on the sides if we have the 2 circles coming together. However, in this lined situation, you can see that blue and yellow circle completely on top of each other, creating that green color. So going on to talk about the mutual information, so the mathematics behind it, this is basically what we see. So this is a very more or less complicated kind of concept or mathematical idea. And one thing that I'd like to note, or 2 things that I'd like to note, is the fact that X and Y actually represent the discrete random variables that we talked about. So the blue and the green, or the blue and the yellow, would represent the X and Y in this case. And what mutual information does is that it quantifies the amount of information obtained about the random variable through observing the other random variable. So one thing that I'd like you guys to remember is we know that if these two random variables are independent, then we would know that the log of this would actually equal to 0. So that's something to keep in mind of. So going back and emphasizing the whole idea of image registration and mutual information, again, to confirm that our images have been registered, a lot of the times we would look at these pixelated images. So do you think the left side or the right side has been more or less registered? So which one do you think has a higher registration or a better registration output? So yeah, I would agree with you. This image is a lot clearer in terms of the colors that we see and the clarity, whereas this one has a lot more grayscale to it. So you see these different kinds of grays and whites and blacks in there, which shows that the image was not as well registered as this image, which is very, very clear in terms of clarity and where, for example, objects are. So if this were an apple, let's just imagine these two images both being apples, what you would see in this case is a massive red area in that middle to represent the shape of the apple that you'd be able to recognize, whereas in this situation you may have a little bit of pink on the outside and on both sides of that apple shape for you to not actually be able to distinctly recognize it as a shape of an apple. And so talking about the interpolator, which is in our case we use bilinear interpolation. So this is the mathematics behind bilinear interpolation. It's very simple in terms of how you just set the coordinates, or you have these coordinates that you put it into these function values. So you have multiple functions that are defined by each of these points in order for you to be able to determine where that exact point is relative to the other points that exist using these equations. So going on to talking about gradient descent, as we talked about before, gradient descent the concept is that it is an optimizer. And so it's an iterative process where each iteration actually refines the parameter values for the computation so that it provides a best parameter for alignment. And in the case of classification, as we saw before, it is that backpropagation method where it uses gradient descent in order to find the most accurate weighting to represent each of these nodes. In this case, it is going through that iterative process to find the parameters that allows us to be able to achieve the best alignment between two images. And so in this case, for our optimizer, as I stated before, we're using gradient descent, and it is an iterative process that allows us to find the minimum or the steepest part of the slope, as we'll see in the next slide. So gradient descent mathematically refers to this thing as we see here. So this is the updated weight. So I'm pretty sure, as you guys remember from that segmentation lecture, what we have is the constant updated weight. So if this is the new origin or the new image that we talked about in the segmentation lecture. And so this is the current weight in terms of where we are. So this becomes edited at every single iteration. And the learning rate basically defines where or how much we're learning with each iterative step. And that's the gradient, or the gradient of the loss function at the current weight that we're at. So as seen before in the segmentation lecture, I would recommend you guys to look back to it if you don't remember or if you haven't watched it. What ends up happening is that we're trying to find that steepest part in each of our functions. And so in this case, if we're starting at point A, what we're trying to find is that very, very minimum point through gradient descent, so through this iterative process. So one thing to note or to remember is that it gradually updates the weight by stepping into the steepest direction to reduce the loss function. So remember, it is constantly updating the weight in order to achieve minimum, always minimum. That's what I like to remember with gradient descent. So the multimodal gradient descent is actually an improvement of the gradient descent that we were talking about before. And the whole idea behind this is the fact that in a very simple function, as you see here, it is very easy for us to determine where the minimum is. It's going to be at that minimum point of the concave function. However, in a situation here where there may be multiple dips that we see, it is very easy for a function or the algorithm through gradient descent to define this point as the minimum as the minimum point, because a lot of times, as we stated before, what ends up happening is that as long as there is some sort of increase, what the gradient descent or what the algorithm does is it goes back, takes a step back to that very minimum point or that last point where it was a minimum and defines this minimum point as the very, very minimum of the entire function. However, as I stated before, in this function, you see that the best minimum is actually here. So what multimodal gradient descent allows us to do is to be able to determine this best minimum without stopping at a local minimum. So as a summary of the entire registration process, what I'd like to see is that what we would have that go through the workflow is we would have the fixed image and the moving image that basically goes through, and we have that metric, and it goes through that training process of continuously registering. So think of your arms in the same way, where you go through that iterative process to be able to find the optimal transformation function for us to be able to have our moving image become registered to our reference image. Thank you.